Thank you, Josh. What a blessing it is to be with you all this morning. It is always good to be home, among people who have been and are such an important part of my own journey. And so I especially appreciate this invitation to preach this morning among you all. And what a morning it is to preach. On the one hand, we are in the Christmas season with its joy and hope. On the other hand, we have this morning's gospel reading with its mass murder of young children. Jarring, to say the least. I contemplated just glossing over this dissonance, either by selecting a different reading or just not talking about it. But it's important for us to embrace this tension. This, too, is a part of the Christmas story. This, too, is a part of our story. Our lives are messy, as we know. Joy, hope, and love intersect with violence, loss, and despair. These things are all real, and this is where Christ meets us. When I was in college singing with the Nordic choir at Luther, our conductor, Dr. Craig Arnold, would speak about this sort of tension before holiday breaks. He would take a moment during our final rehearsal before departing to acknowledge that going home may come with mixed emotions. For some, there may be excitement and relief to have a break from the semester, but for others, home might not be a refuge, but a place of distress and hurt. Dr. Arnold made space for us to take our own circumstances seriously, not to pretend that things are okay when they are not okay. These messages really struck me and have lasted with me, not because I needed that word of comfort. Home has always been a safe, love-filled place for me, and for that I am grateful. But it was a message I still needed to hear for the sake of recognizing that others can have such different experiences. That may seem so obvious. Of course, people have different experiences. Of course, we don't know what everyone is going through. But how often do we take into account that these differences make a difference? More recently, this time now, myself as a professor, I received a poignant reminder during our first class back after Thanksgiving break. Before class began, I was just chatting with students and I asked, "So, did everyone have a nice break? Are you feeling rested?" Many nodded. Some said that they enjoyed their break, but were already stressed to be back at school and having to prepare for final papers and exams. And then one student spoke a difficult truth. "No, I did not have a nice break," she said. "I hate going home. My dad is awful and makes me feel so bad about myself." And there it was. A stark reminder that home is not a safe place for all. And here it is this morning, a stark reminder that Christmas is not a safe situation for all. In fact, immediately after the birth of Jesus, this tender story of life against all odds, of good news and hope for peace, we are confronted by extreme violence. King Herod, who felt his power threatened by a baby prophesied as a king, acted out of his craven desire for control by having babies massacred. His own authority was worth more to him than the lives of every precious child in and around Bethlehem. With this gospel text, we move so quickly from hope to absolute despair, as if going from Christmas immediately to Good Friday. And indeed, in this story, we find Jesus' own death foreshadowed. The same theme will be repeated at the end of the gospel narrative. Those with power will be threatened by Jesus' witness to God's concern and care for the poor, the sick, the forgotten, the abused, the excluded. The powerful will feel threatened, and with good reason, because Jesus does make clear that the first will be last in God's commonwealth. And so, as we know, the authorities will execute Jesus. Christmas and Good Friday go together. The Bible teaches us this. Our lives teach us this. This very morning, there may be those of us basking in the glow of Christmas, of cheerful time with family and friends. And there may be others of us whose hearts are heavy, whether from loss, fear, anxiety, uncertainty, or anything that makes life precarious. Each of our circumstances matter. How, then, do we account for the difference our differences make? Today, we are reminded to pay attention for what is held in tension as we long for safety and well-being. And so in this spirit, I do want to fast forward to the end of the story, to the crucifixion, but even beyond that, to early Christians' understanding of the significance of the crucified Christ. It's heavy stuff, but there's also hope in the truth that can be named. You might be surprised to learn that some of the early followers of Christ, and especially the theologians and leaders of the church who garnered authority and respect, were a bit anxious over potential embarrassment brought by certain biblical depictions of Christ. This is what's striking. I want you to pay attention for this. Some of the most important theologians of the early church were embarrassed by the central image of Christianity. They tried to explain it away. They tried to make it all right. But pay attention for this. Look out for it. We can turn, for example, to interpretation of imagery in Paul's letter to the Philippians. So we'll have that slide before you so you can read the text. In this second chapter, Paul is encouraging the community in Philippi to rally together around Christ, writing, "Adopt the attitude that was in Christ Jesus. Though he was in the form of God, he did not consider being equal with God something to exploit, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a slave and by becoming like human beings." Imagine for a moment the world in which this letter was written. The Romans were in control, and their emperor was revered as a god. And so in some ways we have a competing image of a god here. The Roman economic system ran on slavery, with enslaved people counted and treated as property. Slaveholders exacted all manner of use and abuse on their slaves, including sexual exploitation. Cities were filled with monuments celebrating such power of the Romans and their emperor, with vivid displays of their capacities to conquer and enslave. And I'd like us to look at a few images. So in this first, I'm taking you to the city of Aphrodisias. This is a city in the Roman Empire. And we have here a reconstruction. So we don't see in full what this building would have looked like. But on the left, we see some of this monumental structure. This was a monument that was built to celebrate the imperial family. Roman cities would show off. They would sort of compete to say, we love the emperor's family the most. And so Aphrodisias was a city that really did this. And this was such a monument. So if you can imagine what we see at the front on the left, that would have gone all the way around to the back and around and forward. And if you'll notice on the front, we see some panels. We see 6 panels there, and those panels would have gone all around the structure. And at this archaeological site, some of them, the panels have been sort of put in place again, reconstructed, so that we can get a sense of what it would have been like. But we see more of those panels in the museum, and I'd like to show you 2 of them. So if we go to the next slide, we see here a personification of the emperor as a god who is conquering. So we see this figure naked, showing his power and might, and we see below him these 2 figures who are under his dominion. So this is representing the power of the Romans. If we go to the next slide, we'll see a similar sort of thing, perhaps even more violent. We see Britannia, this representation of Britannia, conquering an enslaved woman, taking as a woman a slave, and we see the sort of violence that would have been represented as a celebration of the Romans. Violence represented celebrating the emperor and his power, and the emperor was understood as a god. So in this world, we can imagine people walking around cities that were marked by structures like this, and in that world, Paul writes this letter, and he says, come together around God in human form, which is the form of a slave. So we see here this incredibly stark contrast. It is into this world that Jesus was born, taking human form, but again, not just any human form. Paul says it's the form of a slave. The one whom Christians revere is not akin to an earthly emperor, but is like someone who has been enslaved. This is like saying in this image that the Christians are taking the position of this woman here who is enslaved. That's Jesus in that photo. Stark contrast. This is a radical reversal, the embodiment of a God who overturns the ways of this world, sent to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. And Jesus doesn't show up as the conqueror, but he shows up in the form of those who are the oppressed. And so we are met here with a tension. And early Christians felt this tension, one between respectability on the one hand, a desire to win over the Romans, and on the other hand, solidarity with the disenfranchised, represented in the image of the enslaved Christ. Some of the most important theologians of the first few hundred years after Jesus' life showed embarrassment and shame over too gritty an image of Jesus. And this might not surprise us. If they're trying to convince the people who are putting up images like this that their God is the God that they should revere, they get embarrassed over the image of Jesus as a slave. Different people would make different kinds of arguments, but there was a common theme. What they said, what they did with this idea from Paul, was to say that Christ in slave form was really no slave at all. What made Jesus impressive, they argued, was that he could take a slave form while actually exemplifying the highest ideals of Greco-Roman philosophy. They described Jesus as essentially an elite Roman man who was self-controlled and had authority of his own body and authority over others. That is, these theologians made Jesus into somebody who would represent what would be impossible for a person who was actually enslaved. Worse, they made Jesus into somebody quite different from the very lives that he came to protect and to lift up. Again, it makes some sense. They wanted to show how Christianity trumped other ways of thinking, and they couldn't convince a bunch of free philosophical types to celebrate someone said to occupy such a low position, a position that would leave them vulnerable to use and abuse and mockery. So they cleaned Jesus up, and they made him respectable. And they did this through words. But at what cost? At whose cost? Another thing that you might be surprised to learn, and I think this is connected, is that for hundreds of years, early Christians were not regularly depicting Jesus crucified. They had art of different sorts of forms, but you wouldn't have gone into a Christian space and seen a depiction of Jesus on the cross. And I think there's a reason for that. I think through words you can explain away and say, this thing that's embarrassing, you see this guy who's crucified, that might be embarrassing, but let us explain how he's really great. But if you depict that, you can't run away from that image. But I want to show you another early representation of Christ. And here we'll go to the next slide. These are actually the same images. So what we have on the left is the actual graffito, a piece of graffiti that was etched into a wall. And so you can't really see it too well because it's thousands of years old. So on the right we have it sketched out. You can sort of see what's happening there. This is referred to as the Alexamenos graffito, and it may be the earliest depiction of Christ crucified. At the same time that these theologians I was talking about were writing, this was happening in this space in Rome. So where this graffiti was found was among all sorts of graffiti in this room in Rome in a building that was used for the training of slaves. So this building would have been occupied by enslaved people who were forced into service, and in particular they were forced into service in the emperor's household. So we're right at the heart of empire, and we're in a space that was habited by enslaved people. And what do we see here among those who are enslaved? We see a figure on a cross. The central image, we'll notice, is the figure hanging on a cross. He wears a short garment that exposes his buttocks, and the most striking feature, you probably already noticed, is that he has the head of a donkey, or some say a horse. This was a common way to parody or make fun of gods within Roman art and literature. They would make them donkey-headed and say, you worship a donkey-headed god, ha 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 ha. Romans also connected donkeys and slaves, regarding both as animals fit for labor. And so we can start to imagine that giving the crucified person in this figure a donkey head might have amplified a joke in a space occupied by enslaved people. They would have gotten the connections that were going on here. Slaves, crucifixion, donkeys, these are all things that go together in the Roman imagination. Below the figure, we see a man who is dressed similarly, so we can imagine they're in a similar sort of social status. His hand is raised in the Roman style of blowing a kiss. And so we can get that this man clearly is expressing reverence for the figure on the cross. And indeed, that the sketching beneath that, these are words written in Greek that translate, Alexamenos worships his God. And so we see here the striking image of an enslaved God crucified being worshipped by an enslaved person. Alexamenos worships his God. What we have is probably a joke between enslaved people who trained together. Perhaps one slave was making light of how his coworker, Alexamenos, was devoted to a god whose distinguishing characteristics were slavish. The crucified figure has the head of a donkey, he wears a garment similar to the enslaved Alexamenos, and he is crucified, which itself was a punishment reserved for criminals and the enslaved. It could be that the image was intended to be mean, to make fun of Alexamenos. But in light also of the other graffiti in the space that was fairly playful, but some of it kind of dark humor, it might just have been a simple way to rib at a friend, as if to say, dude, the God you worship is in a sorry state just like you. That's weird, but, go for it. You do you. Whatever the intention behind the drawing, the image represents the kind of tension that I'm trying to elaborate. It showcases the crucified Christ in the slavish manner that Christians seeking social status, social respectability found embarrassing. They could write about it, but they wanted to explain it away. But for Alexamenos, himself enslaved, it may have been precisely the lowly status of Christ that was empowering, that he found connection with. Alexamenos trusted a God who took human form like his own, recognizing the power of God living and dying in solidarity with people like himself, people who have been disregarded, exploited, excluded, and yet still who are of sacred worth, created in the image and likeness of God. I think Alexamenos got it. He knew the power of the crucifixion. He also knew the power probably of Jesus showing up in a stable full of animals rather than a high, exalted place. But in the traditions that were passed down to us, the wisdom of the enslaved was disregarded. We have received traditions passed down by theologians and church authorities whose social standing afforded them respect, which is why their writings and legacies have been preserved. In contrast, there are no existing first-hand accounts from ancient slaves, Christian or otherwise. I wonder what we are missing through these erasures of history. Might Alexamenos have something more profound to teach us about Christ than those who tried to explain away Christ's human enslaved form? What do we miss when we expect God's wisdom and power to look like the respectable things of the world, but do not pay attention for where and how Christ actually shows up? Jesus did not show up for the popular to make people popular. The theologians whose work were preserved were not bad, evil people. I'm not saying we should, throw it all away. They were horrible. They just needed to learn from Alexamenos and the enslaved rather than to be embarrassed by them. Wisdom is lost when we don't pay attention. Likewise, going back to my story from college choir, I don't need to feel ashamed about going home to a place that is safe and loving. That does not need to be embarrassing or something I should feel bad about. The point I realized when Dr. Arnold offered words of care before choir members went home on holiday breaks was that genuine concern for others has to make space for acknowledging and honoring the range of our experiences. Even further, I think our gospel call is to prioritize the needs of the vulnerable. It's fine when we feel good. That is good. But can we also pay attention for those who are vulnerable? That's where Jesus is pointing us from the start, from the very beginning of the gospel. Especially when we assume comfort and joy, as we so often do around Christmas, we would do well to pause and pay attention for where there is also despair and hurt. This is the oh so messy, but oh so real story of Christmas into which we are invited. In closing, I'd like to share a little bit more reflecting on Matthew's gospel account. Mary and Joseph don't get to go home with their newborn after his birth. Instead, they are forced into exile, fleeing the violence of a tyrant who would massacre children to maintain his power. The text only says that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus went by night to Egypt. It's a pretty quick story. But we might take a moment to pause and wonder, what else was a part of the story? Did farmers at the birth lend animals and food to help for travel? Were there people who gave disguises, suggested secret routes out of town, created diversions to help the family escape? Were they welcomed into Egypt? Were there midwives who attended to the mother and child, keeping them safe and healthy? There must have been other people who sprung into action, because that's what we do when people need help. And what about those families who remained in Bethlehem to face Herod's deadly wrath? Their laments remind us of the utter devastation. At the same time, their cries might lead us to wonder what brave efforts were made to fight back, to protect the children in any way possible. There must have been mothers and fathers and people of goodwill who gave their lives trying to save those precious young ones. This is all the story of Christmas. It is good and right and holy to celebrate the joy, the love, and the hope that are embodied in the birth and life of Jesus, who is good news enfleshed, that we remember in this Christmas season. It is also good and right and holy to acknowledge the pain, loss, and despair that are so very real at the same time. We can hold these truths in tension. At the very moment when we celebrate Christmas, there are people in this world doing what the Holy Family did, crossing borders to flee persecution, doing everything they can to keep themselves and their loved ones safe, not knowing if they will find welcome or will face further persecution. There are people mourning the loss of loved ones, wondering if they will be accepted by their families, struggling with depression, worrying over basic necessities, seeking the strength to escape abuse. Everywhere, there are people just trying to survive. This is the Christmas story. Christmas is about God showing up in the morass, in human form, as a slave, as an immigrant crossing borders with their family to seek safety, as a victim of violence, and also as a survivor, as the embodiment of good news, as the embodiment of a word of hope, of care, of comfort, of safety. This Christmas, may we pay attention for the story that we need to hear, and it may be different for each of us, whether we are invited to feel something of God's peace in a time of turmoil and distress, or to remember that our good feelings are important, but aren't the whole story. How might we show up as bearers of God's mercy, justice, and liberation in a world that is in such deep need? This is the question of Christmas. This is our Christmas call. May we go forth and do this work. Amen.